So I'm going to move on to myth number two, which I've heard a lot, which is that open source technology is low quality. And I think we know this for a fact, having used all kinds of different content management systems, and it almost seems like the ones you pay for are actually nowhere near as good. Like the Microsoft content management systems that I've used were so horrible compared to
And just good
WordPress.
browsers as well.
Browsers.
I think that's the key place where a lot of people know open source, and I think it's one of the places where you can really like convince people that like no, this really does work.
Yeah.
Because of the popularity and the actual quality of Firefox is compare it to things that are proprietary, and I think a lot of people will eventually say like yeah, it is a stronger, better experience because it's taking in the considerations of a lot of different people who use browsers in a lot of different ways who really know what's going on, so they can go, this specifically needs to happen. And I think once you go up the chain of command at, again, say Microsoft, a lot of those little kind of idiosyncratic things you want a browser to do can get lost. So in that respect, I think Firefox is
well, it's really interesting because we talked a little bit earlier about how in a lot of people's minds, the idea of open source means the dilution of an idea, but I think in a lot of cases it can actually be the exact opposite of that, and I think Firefox is a really good example of that, that by opening the project up to the community, they actually kind of managed to come to a more succinct goal, which is just to have a browser that works really well, and that by kind of opening it up and getting more eyes on the kind of code and evaluating it early on, they were able to come up with a much better product when it actually came time to release it. Whereas, if you're developing software with, your specific software team, you've only got 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 sets of eyes looking at something. Whereas when it's open source, you've got the power of, everyone on the internet potentially behind you, working towards that kind of end goal. So,
and it is a different set of eyes too, because when you're working in, say, the corporate level, you're getting a set of eyes that you're paying for that set of eyes to be there for a set amount of time a day or that kind of thing, whereas the open source community is so much based on passion and so much based on these people would be doing this anyway even if they're not ever getting paid for it, and there's a big anonymous part of working in an open source community, whereas your name necessarily isn't attached to it, yet people are still doing it, and I think that's the best situation for really good software and really good products to evolve.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that's driven out of passion, not so much just a paycheck. Makes a big difference in the end quality, for sure.
I feel like we've been harping on Microsoft. It's so easy to harp on Microsoft. Are there other companies that have adopted the open source mentality more than Microsoft? I can think of one.
Well, which one?
IBM. IBM's been a huge proponent of Unix from the beginning, and Linux after that, and MySQL, like they openly support them. They feed them money. They give them donations. And I know I've had some of the best documentation for things like choosing between Drupal versus Django versus Ruby on Rails or whatever. Some of the best documentation comes from IBM. They were dealing with these content management systems ages ago. So I'm kind of excited because IBM's kind of the quiet, huge, like they were the first computer company really out there.
Yeah. Well, they, I think very early on started shipping their servers with Linux.
Yes.
Instead of
Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely like a sleeping giant.
I think so.
There's also companies like kind of Oracle and Sun Microsystems, working with Ray Ozzie, who developed some of the languages that lots of our open source technologies are built on. There's definitely a lot of history behind open source. If you look at it, it goes right back to essentially the invention of the internet. Was really kind of the birth of open source as an idea, and it's been really interesting to watch it kind of propagate through those organizations. A big myth that we hear again and again, and a lot of times from clients too. Generally, the clients that bring this stuff up tend to be a little bit more educated, but one of the big myths that we hear again and again is that there's no real support for open source technologies, and I honestly don't really understand how that myth manages to propagate, because everything I've seen, really proves to be very contrary to that myth.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's perception, right? You think, okay,
Yeah.
well, Microsoft's this big, huge organization. They've got people that,
Are dedicated.
if I have a problem
yeah.
with my content management system, I'll be able to get on the phone and talk to a Microsoft certified guy,
Mhm.
girl. Whereas I think probably getting someone on the phone at Microsoft's going to be pretty difficult.
Pretty difficult, definitely. I know, I mean, even from my dealings with Apple, if I've had an issue with
Oh,
a
yeah.
computer, just a lot of times, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that sees this, that again and again, it sometimes it's very, very hard to actually, get in touch with a physical person, especially with, all these kind of automated answering systems now. There's nothing that I hate more than trying to call and just try and talk to a person, and you just get the robot on the phone
Yeah.
again and again.
Whereas in the open source world, what have we found?
Well,
I think it's been
There's
different.
answers everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think the open source community really has kind of embraced the internet as a communications tool, and really the kind of underlying structure of the internet is what allows people to communicate and share issues and also help other people, and I think one of the big things is that, if open source is something that you really stand behind, I think most people actually have a hard time working with open source technologies without kind of not being forced, but there's actually a big push there to kind of become a part of the community, because as you're searching for knowledge, you're going to come across things that you've seen where you'll come across something on a forum and it's like, oh, I saw that last week, I know how to fix that, and
Yeah, you end up contributing back.
Yeah.
It's part
Or in
and
this-
parcel of the open source culture that you were talking about.
That's
where,
right.
Yeah.
I hang out on Freenode and WordPress and jQuery and Drupal Chicks. And,
Yeah.
Drupal Chicks.
There's a Drupal Chicks channel now.
Can I
Yeah.
get on there?
Sure. On the internet, nobody knows you're going.
Yeah.
But as you
We
hang
won't tell
out in
anyone.
there and you're asking questions and people are giving you answers, you also then feel the participation and desire to give that back when you have the answer that somebody's looking for.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
at the same time, when it's not locked in a system of, say, like all the servers of when you're calling Apple to figure out a project, and they might record your phone conversation, right? But they don't release all those phone conversations for everyone to listen to, right?
Exactly.
But if I had a problem 2 weeks before and I went to a forum and go, I'm having this problem, how do I fix it? And I get an answer within a day, and then you might go the next week, find the answer to my problem, and it's solved like that already. So there's already a benefit there, right? It's archived, it's more open, right? In that
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
It's like an underlying idea of transparency in a way, that I want to be transparent with what I'm doing with the technology, and in return other people are transparent, and I think it's developing that kind of cyclical system of download some code, play with it, modify it, release it back, and then you get this kind of continuing cycle from the community, the greater community, that you're constantly putting stuff out there and they're constantly giving stuff back to you.
Yeah.
I know well, I really kind of first got introduced to that when I first started working with Flash. Just learning Flash, there's a huge kind of learning curve to overcome, and I know when I was first working with it, I'd spend days and days just like combing ActionScript forums, and finally it was like, oh hey, maybe I should start to contribute something back. I've gotten so much from these, and then sure enough, that was kind of the spark. And,
Yeah.
as Andy said.